Okay, good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome here to the Northern Ireland Folk Memorial. My name is Michael Fryer. I'm Partnerships and Engagement lead here at the museum. So you're really welcome. How many of you actually have ever been here before? Okay, some of you have. Okay, and most of you probably haven't. You're really welcome here for this event for LGBT History Month. Just to mention, in the event of a fire, which hopefully will not be happening tonight, we go out of this door and follow us out into the street. That's fingers crossed, not more like that tonight. I've also got my colleague Gemma at the back of the room here. So I'm delighted to be welcoming Dr. Tom Hulme here, who will be giving us a talk about male queer life in Belfast during the Second World War. I'm saying to Tom, before we start tonight, it's really only been over the past couple of years that we've marked LGBT plus History Month, so it's great to actually have Tom bringing his expertise and his research experience and being able to talk about this topic tonight. So I hope you'll all have lots of questions for him, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion as well as part of this evening. Tom is a reader in modern British history at Queen's University Belfast, where he's taught since 2016. He's currently working on a book called Belfast Men, an intimate queer history of Ireland, and has written on this topic for both Gay Times and Irish Historical Studies. He's also working with Leanne McCormick from Ulster University, Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, and the LGBT charity Parent Friend on the Arts and Humanity Research Council project entitled Queer Northern Ireland, Sexuality Before Liberation. And you might be talking a little bit about that as well, if that's all right. So you're very welcome, and we're really looking forward to what you have to share with us tonight. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I should start with an apology, which is I'm going to sit down, not just because I'm lazy, but I pulled my back this morning, so I've got a really sore shoulder. But I'll be okay, so don't worry too much. And it's lovely to be here during LGBT History Month, of course. Remember though, gays are not just for LGBT History Month, you know, they're for the whole year. We can be seen doing other things as well, but it's not the kind of place I've done a talk before, I don't think. Not many museums, but certainly not a war memorial museum. So it did lead me to think about, well, where does war appear in the work that I've been doing? And I'm going to focus a lot on the Second World War, but actually the military world and how that informed cultures of sexuality goes back way before that conflict as well. So I will talk a little bit about that. And maybe we could start with this big book about homosexuality that was published in 1908, which has a whole chapter on what it describes as military prostitution. Now, the author published this under a pseudonym for obvious reasons. He didn't want to have his real name associated with a scandalous work like this. But he explained to his readers that some young soldiers were what he described as being constitutionally homosexual. Basically, that their natural sexual impulse was primarily or entirely towards other men. But he also suggests in this chapter on military prostitution that there were some soldiers who were driven instead by mercenary motives. The army simply did not pay enough, and they had to sell their bodies just to get by. And Belfast is no different than anywhere else in that sense. But it's usually older men and wealthier men who were willing to pay, and younger men and poorer men who were willing to sell. And it's only a brief reference in this book, but at one point he does describe how both soldier-soldier and soldier-civilian relationships were ingrained in subcultures throughout North America and Europe, and including in the cities of North Britain and of Ireland. So a kind of early sense that this isn't something that is only happening in the more obvious cities like London or New York, but also in places like Dublin and indeed Belfast. And of course, there were barracks in and around Belfast throughout the 19th and 20th century. And occasionally, because of that, servicemen do crop up in the historical record. And for a lot of this period, it is really criminal records that we have to use to try and find the sorts of men who were selling sex or perhaps just having sex out of sheer pleasure. Now, probably the most outrageous example can be found in 1894, when an English soldier chef called Frederick McGlinchey found himself in trouble in the city centre. Now, he was working at the Victoria Barracks, cooking for the officer class, but lodging in North Belfast. But most of his time was spent cruising the city centre. Now, we know this because on one evening, he rather stupidly, or perhaps boldly, stopped a policeman one night on the high street and asked him where the nearest public toilets were. And when that policeman then showed him, took him down towards one of the Belfast entries, and showed him where the toilets were. The young man instead grabbed hold of his trousers and tried to undo them. And as we might have expected, the policeman was not that happy about this and gave the young man a slap on the ear, and he then ran off. Less than an hour later, he was found in another public toilet elsewhere in the city having sex with another soldier, and was arrested for that and given 4 months in prison. After he was released, though, he went back to working in the army across Ireland and Britain for decades afterwards, and actually married and had his own family. And soldiers carried on getting themselves in trouble in Belfast for a long time after McGlinchey in 1894. And another scandalous example, though it's forgotten today, came when 2 English soldiers were dragged into court in 1952. And this is a case that my colleague Charlie, who's here, has done some work on. These were 2 English soldiers who were stationed in Hollywood, but came into Belfast for fun and entertainment. And they described how one evening a mysterious man had picked them up outside the City Hall of Belfast in a big, luxurious car and driven them back to an even bigger mansion near Lisbon. They were treated to all the drinks they wanted, whiskey and so on, and they stayed the night. Now, the English newspapers, when they got hold of this story, they reported that this was the house of Patrick Barber, a well-known man of a wealthy and influential local family, but the newspapers in Northern Ireland suppressed that detail. And instead, it was actually another man who also happened to be English who took the fall, a set designer from London, and spent some time in prison. Now, even more common in the record than soldiers when it comes to servicemen are sailors, both Royal and Merchant Navy. And it is sailors really that are lauded by homosexual men for being kind of the epitome of manliness. You know, they've got gruff voices, sexy uniforms, and they can talk about their exotic and perhaps erotic adventures at sea. Now, we know this because the travel writer Robin Harbinson, who grew up in East Belfast, hinted at his lust for these men in a memoir of his early life. When he was just in his 20s and travelling to North America after the Second World War, he shared a cabin with Canadian seamen aboard the passenger ship RMS Aquitania. And he describes how, and I quote, "Mama would have swooned in horror at the sight of 30 young men strutting naked between the cabin and shower baths, flicking towels at each other's buttocks. What would she have said about the huge hairy thighs swinging contentedly over the edge of bunks?" Now, Harbinson was actually writing for a respectable audience at a time when homosexuality was not just still taboo, but indeed illegal. But I think his descriptions of muscular bodies that wrestled and writhed, panting and sweating, no holds barred on the cabin floor, left little to the imagination. Now, for those men who moved in queer circles, or at least already knew the rumours of rum, sodomy and the lash, Harbinson's musings on sailors would have been quite obvious. And I think it's easy enough to see why sailors were such popular figures on urban scenes such as Belfast. But it is worth remembering that they were not always just paid partners for wealthy and middle-class men. Often they were the ones who were looking for casual sex as well, whether they were now permanently resident living in Belfast after an early sailor career, or they were just on shore leave. And like their comrades in the armed forces who were being paid for their bodies, they could justify these sorts of relationships for a variety of reasons, long before there was such a thing as a gay identity that we might see later in the 20th century. They were simply seen as being more available, and they experienced that as well. There was a relative absence of female partners in maritime cultures, long journeys at sea. We can imagine what happened. And also there was in some sense an idea or an understanding that it was less immoral to have sex with another man than it was to have sex before marriage and have an illegitimate child. So these are reasons why some men had sex with each other without necessarily worrying about it. And when we look at the criminal record, they're both paying for and selling sex around the docklands of the city. They're drinking in the bars and then taking their lovers home, or they're hanging around those notorious entries where Frederick McGlinchey got arrested in the 1890s. But it is really the exceptional circumstances of the world wars which allowed for that movement of thousands of men between countries and the all-male worlds that they tended to live in that made this sort of cruising culture even easier to find. Now, one of the best examples we have is from 1917, against the backdrop of the First World War, of course. Vincent Cassidy, a man who was the son of a Catholic saddler from Armagh. He'd already lived in Dublin, London, in New York by this point when he was in his early 20s. And now when he was returning to Belfast in 1917, he passed through Liverpool. where he made a connection with another man called Jack Fearon, who was a soldier in the King's Liverpool Regiment. Francis Kavanagh, who was another young soldier from Cork, had also met this man, Jack Fearon, when they'd been training together in a camp in Formby, which is a town near Liverpool. In early September, Francis Kavanagh, the man from Cork, and Jack Fearon, the man from Liverpool, ran into each other in Belfast when they were both on leave, and they learned that there was a party happening in the Imperial Hotel being hosted by Vincent Cassidy. This went on for several months. Vincent Cassidy had a couple of rooms for himself, and he held parties where civilians and soldiers rubbed shoulders. They drank whiskey cocktails, the men danced with each other, and of course, had sex as well. And this only ended when Francis Kavanagh was picked up by the police. And I think as a way to try and get off the charge of desertion, he told them what was happening in the hotel, deflected the interest of the police. Now, Vincent Cassidy had relationships both with servicemen and civilians, and also, in fact, with men and women. But there is evidence to suggest that there were many middle-class men who were lusting after soldiers in particular. Now, we have a good case of this from 1939 of a man called Henry Blair, who was an insurance manager in his late 40s. He was travelling between Liverpool and Belfast on the MV Ulster Prince when he found himself in trouble. He'd actually booked onto the ship in a double berth, i.e. 2 beds, with his own name and also a man called Mr. Martin. But it seems that no Mr. Martin actually boarded the ship. And I think this is probably because he wanted, if he was seen with another man going into the bedroom, that they would assume that they were taking separate beds. But in reality, he was actually trying to pull the many soldiers who were travelling on that ship. Indeed, there was an infantry battalion from the South Wales Borderers. He was paying for all the drinks, this man, Henry Blair, and trying to take them back to his room. One young man, a private called Douglas Taylor, said he took a chance and went to Blair's cabin because he didn't have anywhere of his own to sleep, but he refused to get in the same bed after some encouragement from Blair. Undeterred, Henry Blair went back to the bar on the ship, picked up another young man called William D. Williams, which must be the Welshest of all Welsh names to exist. Taylor must have told his comrades what he suspected was now happening with Private Williams, because a group of them went down to the cabin and banged on the door until sheepishly, partially dressed, Williams opened it up. When Blair then disembarked off the ship in Belfast a couple of hours later, he found that the police were waiting for him. And the police recorded how they had found an incriminating tub of Vaseline under his pillow. And I'll leave to your imagination what they were doing with the Vaseline. But it is really the Second World War, 39 to 45, that was the transformative moment when it came to the creation of a new sort of identity based around sexual choice. And it's that close homosocial world of the armed forces. It has erotic potential. And queer behaviour is actually relatively tolerated at this point, from drag performances to keep up morale, or casual sex among soldiers for the same reason. And young men in huge numbers are being pulled away from the home or the small community and given an opportunity now to test out not just their patriotic duty, but their sexual prowess as well. But of course, there was always the risk of a court-martial and then a disgraceful discharge. And we do have evidence to suggest that men living in Belfast, that this was an important moment for them for realising sexuality. There was one man who was arrested in Belfast in 1947 who told the courts how he understood he was same-sex attracted as young as 11, but it was only when he joined the Royal Marines during the war that he learnt a lot more about sex life. He described to the courts how in 1944 he'd gone out east and discovered in India the books that explained what his sexuality actually was. And there's another man from Bangor who was arrested much later in the 1960s, who also told the courts that he'd fallen in with active homosexuals when he had joined up in 1945, and now admitted that he had the same sexual persuasion. Now, many of the men we have records for, as you might have gathered, were prosecuted, usually after one sexual encounter, and that is where we find the evidence of these sorts of desires and relationships. But it was possible to have longer-term private relationships, not just about cruising in public toilets or other public places. In the late 1950s, for example, there was a sailor in his late teens from North Belfast who met the Scottish love of his life while they were both at sea in the Royal Navy. They were discharged after they made it clear to their commanding officers that they did not want to be separated. And on those occasions when they were apart, they wrote beautiful love letters to each other. One of the most poignant ended, "I want you to know that I will never, ever go back on anything I said. I promise that I will always be faithful to you, knowing that now I have conquered any difficulties that would have prevented me from being so. Never lose faith in me, for I am forever yours. Faithfully and completely, I love you. You are constantly in my thoughts and my dreams." Now, when this young man was on shore leaving England and lonely without his lover, he was also consoled by other naval comrades and civilians on the gay scene. There was a sailor who went by the nickname Rosie, who showed Nelson, this young man, the gay bars of Portsmouth, which was at this point a hotspot on the south coast. He also introduced him to several of his camp friends who kindly promised to help him with the situation that was developing in the Navy just before he was chucked out. Now, if life at camp or on the front lines or at sea could be a revelation for young queer men in particular, the Second World War also enlivened the scene back in Belfast. Northern Ireland, as many of you will know, was strategically important for the war effort, both because of its location in the Atlantic and its use as a launching point for American servicemen. And already by 1941, there were over 100,000 British troops stationed in canvas camps, huts, or requisitioned buildings. And between 1942 and 1944, over 300,000 Americans also passed through. At one point, 120,000 being stationed here. Now, given that the population of Northern Ireland at this point is about 1.2 million people, you can see how these are huge figures that really transformed what everyday life was like for most people who are living here. And it is that exotic and exciting presence of American GIs, oversexed, overpaid, and over here, as the famous phrase goes, that provoked fears about sexual immorality. But it was mostly women who found themselves under the glare of negative publicity. But it is the case that the sexual opportunities that American troops brought to Belfast also delighted the men of the city, though none of these visitors appear to actually have ended up being arrested themselves. And in fact, convictions during the Second World War are relatively low, and there was no discernible moral panic. And in fact, even when men were arrested, the reports in the press were shorn of any detail that actually told about what had happened. And that was different to the 1930s when there was much more detail given. I think that's probably because in religiously superior Ulster, it was bad for wartime morale to admit the existence of same-sex desire, given how many religious and political divisions there already were in the city. Now, if the authorities continue to remain tight-lipped about desire in Belfast between men, servicemen, whether on leave or passing through on journeys to other cities, were undoubtedly an important and now very visible part of the urban sexual scene. And it was, by many accounts, a relatively exciting and liberating time. There was an English artist called Neville Johnson who had moved to Ireland in the 1930s, and he described how even in sturdily provincial Belfast, in nests of anarchy and deviation, orgies took place and mayhem prevailed. Now, whether any of the orgies that Johnson was referring to were made up solely of gay men is now knowledge that is lost to time, although we do know that this painter did have lots of gay friends himself. And there was another gay man who much later recalled that the urinals were especially full the morning after the unexpected and devastating Luftwaffe raid in 1941. And it may have been the case that the horror of destruction, paradoxically as this may seem, had led to a devil-may-care sexual attitude among men who maybe usually managed to contain their desires. And as we might have expected, as it was earlier in the 20th century, it's in the Docklands that the bustling clubs and bars are servicing military men and the gay men who are chasing them. And Do Barry's was the city's most notorious bar at this time. Some of you may remember Do Barry's. It only shut down, I think, in the 1990s. For those of you who don't know the bar, it was near the Albert Clock in Queen's Square, which was already a well-known cruising site going back all the way to the time of Roger Casement in the early 20th century. And it was so popular because it is right in the path of passengers who are disembarking from the steamships, and it is at the end of tram lines that can take people in and out of the city. Now, Do Barry's is still popularly remembered in Belfast as being a legendary brothel, but it was also popular with queer men too. This is probably because it had a relatively tolerant atmosphere. It's not that it is a gay bar as such, but it's just a kind of rough and rowdy bar where anything went, and that included gay men picking up sailors and soldiers. And during the war, we know that one middle-aged man who happened to be a puritanical teetotaler was quite alarmed when he found out that his latest crush, who was a young merchant sailor, did not just have another lover in the Navy, but had also been drinking in Dewberries with his comrades as well. And maybe while that young sailor was there, he met Jared Dillon, an Irish artist who was born in the west of the city. Jared Dillon visited the bar with other bohemian friends during the Second World War and drew sketches of servicemen, Americans in particular, for the simple, cheap price of a drink. And those sketches now, I'm sure, are worth a fortune. But he apparently cruised Dublin's docks as well and spent many years in the more vibrant scene of London. So perhaps he'd been looking for the same sorts of pleasures in Dewberries in Belfast. And the darkness of the blackout could also provide a degree of cover for quick sexual encounters. In March 1941, two young men were found together in a public toilet in Queen's Quay in the Docklands late one evening. Neither had good reason to be there. One was a 19-year-old industrial worker from Newton Ards, and the other was a lieutenant corporal in the Royal Army Medical Corps and based at Malone Road. And that man was 22. He told the police that he didn't even realise that what they were doing was an offence. However, believe him is hard to know, I think. Both of them still ended up with time in prison, despite trying to suggest they didn't actually know it was a crime. The vast majority of servicemen, though, did not get arrested, and they had all sorts of different relationships with civilians in Belfast. We have a diary of a man who lived in Belfast in the 1940s, which covers the period of the war, and he described the multiple opportunities that the city streets brought at this time. In April 1942, for example, he picked up a young serviceman in Smithfield Market, later took him back to his house for tea, where they had a pleasant time chatting about the poetry of Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman. This same man entertained other soldiers at his house, possibly including some Americans, and he often gave them lifts in his car. But it's unclear whether these relationships always went beyond friendship to something more romantic. But the amount of cruising servicemen on the streets of the city is so high that this diarist now found he had stiff competition for the younger men that he preferred. Outside what was gay hotspot works. But his invite for an evening out with this young man was turned down because he'd already arranged to meet an Air Force officer and then skipped off with another Air Force man who just happened to be passing. So you get a sense of the excitement and the opportunities that existed at this point. Later the same night, the diarist, after he'd met no one else around the city, decided to go back to Woolworths, where he ran into another young man, again, chatting with an Air Forceman. So this is the kind of culture that existed at the time. Now, early on, when the war had just begun, there'd been concerns in Belfast that hundreds of servicemen were aimlessly wandering the streets with nothing to entertain them, especially on the Sabbath, when the cinemas tended to shut their doors. Now, one man who was particularly worried about this was the Reverend W.S. Kerr. He was preaching in St. Anne's Cathedral and appealed to the fathers and mothers whose own sons may tonight be in strange cities. And he made it clear that the dangers were sexual. Our young soldiers and sailors are on Sundays exposed to peculiar moral temptations. Many are lying in wait to lure them into evil. Agents are busy to attract them to dens of iniquity, where the loss of their money is not the worst disaster. Now, whether this reverend realised it was not just the pimps and prostitutes who had their eyes on servicemen is not that clear. But the Women's Volunteer Patrol, which was set up in 1943, was concerned only with the behaviour of young women. Either way, for Belfast Square men, the streets thronging with handsome young soldiers was more of an exciting prospect than a moral conundrum. Now, wartime Belfast is obviously not as radical or as busy as the paved double bed that was London during the Blitz. But I think there were pockets of a more cosmopolitan and indeed sexually adventurous culture, and it was encouraged by that paradoxically socially relaxing influence of global conflict. But I think it's worth remembering that for the men who served, the war was more than just a sexual opportunity. Henry Murray, for example, was a bobbin turner from Sailortown and aged just 17 years old when he got into trouble in 1926, having sex with an American sailor in the Dockland area. He did manage to persuade the police on that occasion that it was the other man's idea to have sex and escaped punishment because of that. But in 1938, he joined the merchant service, following in the footsteps of his own father, who was a career soldier who had fought in the First World War. Now, in this occasion, Henry Murray was awarded the British Empire Medal after showing great bravery during the war after his ship was torpedoed. The newspapers described how Murray displayed outstanding courage and devotion to duty. He remained in the engine room until there was no hope of saving the ship and was among the last to leave. And intriguingly, when this was reported in the local press, the Belfast newsletter noted that he was 34 years old and unmarried. Now, Maurice Neal was another Belfast lad, a hairdresser in peacetime who worked at his father's shop on Rosemary Street. He was interested in the late 1930s in writing short stories, attending the theatre, but also playing rugby and other sports. And in those diaries that I mentioned before, we get a glimpse of his life and the friends that he'd made in the queer scene of Belfast when he was about 21 at that point. On one occasion, the diarist describes how they parted late one evening. I got his coat from the hall and he put it on in the morning room as the hall lamp was not lit. When we got to the front door in the porch, I took his hand in mine and was bidding him good night when my control completely gave way. Taking him in my arms, I kissed him on the cheek. Do you mind? I whispered. No, he replied, and turned his face so that I kissed him on the lips. I left him to the tram corner and I went home to know and express what lying awake for happiness means. Now, Maurice Neal did have girlfriends as well as boyfriends, which shows us that binary category of homosexual and heterosexual was not always as fixed as we might assume. But how his life may have turned out, we will now never know. On the 9th of July, 1943, the Northern Whig, local newspaper, reported that Flight Sergeant Maurice Neal of the RAF had been killed in action. He had joined up in 1941 and finished his training in Canada. And he was in fact scheduled to have been on leave at home just a week before he was killed, and of course never made it. He was an only son and survived both by his mother and his grandmother. Today his name is listed on the Air Force's memorial at Runnymede overlooking the Thames that commemorates the names of over 20,000 airmen who were lost in the war during operations from bases in the United Kingdom and Europe, and of course who have known graves. I've said a lot in this about their arrests, but these soldiers and sailors were more than just their sexual desires or sexuality. They were also brave men who signed up and fought for their country, even when that country had criminalized their victimless desires. And some of these men even paid the ultimate price. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that. I'm going to take a seat beside Tom. What I thought was have a little bit of a short discussion, and then that will give you time if you haven't come up with a question or comment yet before that. But I want to ask you first of all about, so obviously you're doing this talk, but you're doing a wider project called Queer Northern Ireland. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, actually?
Sure, yeah. So the wider project, I guess, is more ambitious in that it looks at a much longer time frame. So we begin in the 1880s, which, as some of you will know, was when there was a recriminalisation of sex between men in 1885. And the first cases that were prosecuted in Belfast around about 1890 for those. And we go all the way up into the 1970s with the birth of a more open gay rights movement. And it's lovely to see some of the people who were involved in that movement here tonight as well. And we also look at not just men, but women as well, and indeed trans people, although they are harder to find in the historical records. And we don't just look at cruising and sex, we look at love, relationships, the books that people were reading, the sorts of ways they thought about their themselves, the friendships they also formed with straight people. One of the most exciting parts of the research to me is finding out just how included many of the men I've studied were in their own communities. If they were unfortunate enough to end up in court, their families were giving them the bail money, they were turning up to give character references, and if they were indeed put in prison, when they were released, they went back to live with those families. And all the evidence suggests that many of these men were important parts of those families. So we're trying to get a really kind of, I guess, it's an awful word, but a holistic look at what queer life was actually like in all of its diversity.
So obviously the project, as you say, it covers from, I mean, you're covering 90 years basically, aren't you? Which is a huge breadth of time. You've obviously covered a lot of this tonight in terms of your own talk, but do you think you could sum up? Have you been able to get a perspective? I mean, obviously this is a museum about Northern Ireland during the Second World War, which is why we're discussing this in particular tonight. Do you have a perspective on how the war stands out in terms of that whole breadth of time. And you've talked tonight, for example, about identity and then opportunity as well. Is there a way, could you sum it up?
Yeah, I think it is important. And in a sense, Northern Ireland is not different in that respect. Lots of historians have spoken about the Second World War as being this vital moment that brought people together, who then kind of formed an identity movement later. So of course we have the gay liberation movement in the 70s, but before that there was the homophile movement in the 50s and the 60s. And many of those men involved in that spent time in the army, and they found that a kind of a release in some ways, being dragged away from small towns or indeed the countryside. This is an opportunity to kind of test and understand desires. And unlike the First World War, there is much more public knowledge by this point too, and much more literature. What you would have been able to get hold of during the First World War to read about homosexuality would have been pretty rare, pretty narrow. But there's a somewhat of an explosion at this point. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first gay bar in Belfast is not really until the late 1950s, early 60s. The Royal Avenue Hotel Bar. I think the earliest we have for that is 1958. And that some of the men who were arrested did talk about the war being important for them in creating that sense. There are differences though too. The emergence of a public debate about homosexuality only happens in Northern Ireland in the 50s. In the 1930s, it's silence. It's thought better to not admit that this exists. In the 50s, it's too late for that now, because there are sex scandals happening on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed happening in Belfast too. So that is the beginning of, I think, a more open culture. So Belfast, it shares a lot of similarities with other places, but it has its own unique aspects too.
Well, that was going to be my next question, in terms of one of the things we try to really emphasize in this museum is the fact that actually Northern Ireland had quite a unique experience of the Second World War compared to other places. So, for example, there was no conscription here, unlike in the rest of the UK. I wonder if you could comment. I mean, do you see real differences then in terms of the experience of queer men in the case of tonight compared with the rest of the UK? But also, I mean, I don't know if you've been able to do, your project obviously focuses on Northern Ireland, but what was happening perhaps in the south as well during the emergency? Do we see differences between what was happening north of the border and south of the border during the war?
That's a good question. So I think the density of foreign servicemen here is extreme, and that definitely coloured the culture that was taking place. So the diarist that I mentioned, he's cruising the city throughout the 30s, but the 40s just, the early years of the war just sound wild. Like it's kind of everywhere in the city. And I think that did have a kind of transformative effect. Now, whether that was happening in the South is hard to know. The South did have its own culture, and there were more bars that were known as being accessible for gay men in particular. It's like Bartley Duns, for example. Whether there were soldiers traveling down from the north to the south, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. It's more dangerous in the south. The arrest rate is much, much higher. There is 1 year in the 30s where as many men are arrested in St. Stephen's Green as are arrested in Belfast over about 30 years. So, and I don't think that's that people in Dublin are gayer. I think it's just the police there are much more actively, there's a sense of the new Irish Free State has to be moral and pure. So they're really cracking down on cruising.
And you talked tonight about queer men. Is there anything you could say about the experience of queer women? And obviously, there were so many men who went into uniform. There were actually quite a lot of women, of course, who joined the Wrens and the ATS and the WAF as well. And obviously, women's lives were transformed in all kinds of ways by the Home Front. Is there a way, do we know much about that?
So not a huge amount. There is a reference to, in an oral history that's told in the Imperial War Museum, about a female couple in a camp, an army camp in the north. But there isn't a huge detail on other women. But we do know that more broadly, those sorts of all women worlds, charitable work, philanthropy, and then the armed forces does create those similar sorts of opportunities. It is the case, of course, that lesbian women do exist in Northern Ireland, but they are harder to find for a range of reasons. Firstly, the masculine culture of the city. It is men who have that freedom to go around the city late at night on their own and meet in those sorts of cruising scenarios, whereas women it is much harder. But that doesn't mean that they didn't exist, and there are suggestive newspaper reports about women dying and leaving all their possessions to another woman who they lived with for 40 years, suggestive things like that. And I was reading just this week a religious psychology book from the 1960s that spoke about a lesbian couple in Belfast who even had a marriage ritual.
Wow.
And then they went to the continent for the honeymoon. So, that world did exist, even if it's harder to find.
And obviously it's LGBT plus History Month. I know you're a very, very busy man, particularly this month. Can you talk a bit about, I mean, you're obviously very passionate about LGBT history. What do you think are the kind of main challenges for researching this? And what do you see are the opportunities as well?
I think the main challenges are the level of public knowledge there already is. And I think people have very set understandings of what queer history or gay history, or LGBT history, whatever phrase you want to use actually is, and when it started. And when I moved here in 2016, I was desperate to do a new project on gay history, and I spoke to a few people here, and there was this sense that, well, there isn't really anything before the 70s, and the 70s, because of how active people were in the gay rights movement, left loads of material, which is absolutely brilliant for the historian. There are minutes, there are programs, there are letters. The Cara Friend archive is this incredible resource for learning about what life was like for people, which means that if you want to find out about what happened before, you have to dig around in all sorts of different records, some of them quite murky, criminal files that we use to prosecute people. So I think the difficulty I have, although I like it, it's an exciting challenge, is saying to people, life was difficult in some ways before the gay rights movement, but also in some ways it was quite exciting and vibrant as well, even if that might be surprising. And the Northern Irish challenge especially is that we have this dark figure that looms over everything, which is the Reverend Ian Paisley. And if I ever talk to anyone in England, the first thing they know about is Save Ulster from Sodomy. And, yes, that was here, of course, and it was awful, but it was only ever a kind of a minority of people. They were a very noisy minority.
Yeah.
But, I want to suggest that actually there was a lot more tolerance and acceptance here than we might have assumed. And I think that's quite a powerful message, that for a long time, men were an important part of their family.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to open it up now to yourselves. Have you any questions or thoughts for Tom? Yes, Brian.
I was just thinking your first slide, it was Xavier or someone. Xavier's a very popular name.
That's interesting. So the
Very
pseudonym he used was Xavier Main, and his real name was Edward something Prime Stevenson. He's a sort of mysterious figure who did travel around a lot, but was American originally.
And that was a photograph.
That was a photograph of him, yeah, looking pretty camp.
No, it just was.
Yeah.
Thinking out,
But it is the case that especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, lots of men do see sexuality through religion. They see it through the tales of David and Jonathan, for example, is one religious model that people follow. And of course, the all-male world of religious institutions is, exciting for some men, even the priesthood, So as scandalous as that might be. So maybe he was Catholic. I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
The surname would not suggest this proper surname. But,
yeah.
But
the one he chose, yeah. Well, there's a bit of a cult of people that follow Cardinal Newman. There are religious influences in the kind of gay culture of the time.
And how did you come across diaries? Are they from the archives?
They're from the archives. They are referenced in another book very briefly, and I found kind of fortuitously through searching Google Books, basically. I'm being cagey about what the name of the diarist is, because we are working with the BBC at the moment to create a dramatisation of the diaries. So we want to kind of save the announcement. But basically, these diaries cover 40 plus years, millions of words, and are expressively gay.
Yeah, it's very exceptional for those.
Very exceptional.
To first of all be written and survive.
Yes.
Family often destroy them.
He wanted them to go to the archive.
I see.
So in his will, he often goes back and edits his diaries to make them more legible. Because he was imagining a reader, and in his will, he says something along the lines of, "I leave these diaries to my nephew to do whatever he wants with them, but he's also in constant communication with Prony, and he leaves his whole archive to them, which includes all sorts of other stuff as well, business records and that kind of thing. So he wanted them to be used, but they're not catalogued as being gay diaries. So that's why no one, I guess, had found them before.
I became very good friends with a man who was born in 1920, and so the contact became a friend. But then and in fact, I got to know him outside that. And he died at the age of 90 in 2012, 92, I guess, and it's a pity. He had many stories about, but I wasn't geared enough to, think that these stories might be of value. About Belfast during the war,
Wow.
he was in 2019, he would come into town from Ballandary, and he just said sex was there, the toilets, for him. But that's all I can remember is that.
Was this the same guy who gave information to Jeff?
Yeah.
Because that's where I got it from. So
yes,
we're kind of passing it down the generation.
Yeah.
I will tell my great-grandchildren and they can pass it on to.
Yeah, but in later life, I think when he was about 70, he was arrested in Botanic Gardens. He was
20 years ago.
yes. Well, but that was the first time in his life, although he had cruised or picked up men throughout his life.
Yeah.
And there was a police sting of sorts, and about 5 or 6 men were all arrested in the same particular day. And all of the others, he contacted me and Jeff. We advised him to plead not guilty when they all appeared in court. And so the next day, everyone else pleaded guilty, and their names were in the paper the next day. But his name, because he hadn't pleaded guilty, was kept out.
Right.
Or the press, since he thereafter, when his case occurred, perhaps a month or two later, when his trial came, I went with him to the court, and the case was, he pleaded not guilty, and the case was dismissed, and so he was kept out of the.
I mean, it's amazing to me as someone who came to Northern Ireland and gradually learned more about the history of this place, how much worse the policing was in the 80s and the 90s. That is when the stings are taking place and when they're playing agent provocateur.
Yeah.
And I don't think the prison sentences were as long. A lot of these men who I'm talking about here, because this is before the law changed here in 1982. So what they're being convicted of is slightly different. But anyway, you could get up to kind of 2 years usually before that. So I think the men later in the 20th century are getting shorter sentences or whatever, but the amount being arrested was crazy. I think there were probably more men arrested in the 80s than there was in every other decade put together.
Yeah.
And that continued until the early noughties, when I think there was a kind of a new relationship with the PSNI.
And also, I think the law and attitudes were changing in London, with the Labour government, and that was making a difference.
Yeah.
Did you want to?
I just wonder if you were much violence or prejudice against the gay men during the war, when straight soldiers went over.
So we don't have anything very, very direct from Belfast. Beyond that, lots of these men in peacetime as well had lots of straight friends. And I get the sense that there was a fair degree of live and let live went on. Now, there were some things that were more frowned upon than others. Intergenerational relationships, especially if young men were, below the age of, or not necessarily even the age, but were seen to be younger. That could cause upset. And a lot of the arrest reports we have come because a civilian, I guess, if you want to put it that way, has broken up an encounter that's happening between, say, a man who's 18 and a man who's 40 or something. So they think that should be broken up. So there is some degree of intolerance, if you want to put it that way, I suppose. And it is dangerous for men who are cruising. You can be beaten up, you can be robbed, you can be blackmailed. Now, these things all happened, but by the very nature of those crimes, we'll never know how much, because if you're blackmailed, you have a reason to not go and tell the police. The worst example we have is of a man who was blackmailed in the 1930s and killed himself in Coal Island. And he left, a really heartbreaking suicide note where he names the man who had done that. And I think the most interesting thing about that case was that the newspapers were absolutely horrified that someone had done that to him. They were more angry about the blackmailer than they were about the man, having sex with another man. So, again, suggests a degree of tolerance, and there are some crimes that are worse than others. And I think the police were just turning a blind eye a lot of the time. We know from records in Dublin that the police would sometimes move men on, say, we can see what you're doing, go away. But the lack of arrests here, we're talking 1 or 2 a year in a bad year. So, it's happening most of the time without people knowing or caring. And we even have examples of straight men defending gay men, to other people when they're being gossiped about, for example. So I would expect that continued during the Second World War. And you do have this sense from other books about the war in the US and Britain that gay men were good fun. They were good for morale. They were dressing up, they were entertaining the troops, they were having sex, while men were away from their wives and girlfriends. So, I'm sure homophobia did exist, and you could be court-martialed. That was possible. But I think there was a degree of tolerance as well.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I've enjoyed the talk and the discussion, but it's just like the Doug here referred to the law and the actions and whatnot, which you emphasized correctly. But I'd like to ask you about attitudes. To give you an anecdotal example, I'm not from Belfast, I'm Welsh, and looking around here, none of you was here in the war, but I was, the Second World War, not the first. And I was brought up in the wilds of Wales, and my father's brother was married to a lady, my Auntie Phyllis, who I never saw her without the moustache or trousers. It was a wild little village in Wales, and she had a girlfriend, and my girlfriend was her girlfriend's daughter in school. So it's all very complicated. But the point is, there were 2 very famous women in my village. My Auntie Phyllis, with her girlfriend, married to my uncle, and another lady called Half a Crown Elsie.
I can imagine what her job was.
What she was doing, right? But the point I'm making is that what was interesting was that the attitudes in the village, my village, were quite open. They didn't mind. In other words, previous wars said lesbians don't exist. So, but everybody in my village knew that my Auntie Phyllis had a girlfriend. My Auntie Phyllis never slept ever with my Uncle Harold. Never. Right? And that attitude is very open and whatnot. What you didn't discuss in your talk, okay, the law, these people were breaking the law and they were found guilty. What was the attitude of the general population? Because when I look back on it now, in my Welsh village, people were quite tolerant. When my uncle died, the Welsh are very religious. We go to chapel 3 times a day, this sort of thing, right? My aunt was put in the front row of my uncle's funeral with her girlfriend. We all had to sit in the back. That was the attitude.
I found a remarkable degree of tolerance, not just in the city, but in the countryside as well. And, lots of examples I can think of, but a nice one of a young man who was arrested in the 20s, and his name was splashed across the newspaper. And he unfortunately died just a couple of years later of illness, typhoid, I think. When he died, the same newspaper that had reported him being arrested and pilloried him for it, reported how now all of the neighbourhood had turned out for his funeral. They'd sent flowers. They'd put notices in the press from the Loyal Orange Lodge about how important this local young man was. Now, I think, especially for working class people in the country and in the city, they don't like the law particularly, and they see that as being an overbearing influence on their lives. And they think, actually, it's none of the law's business what we are doing, which is why I found very little men being reported by other men. That doesn't happen very much at all. only when it is something that they see as being a bad relationship. So in a much older man and a much younger man, then they might get involved. Otherwise, I think it is let them live. And as long as they're not being forced to confront sex as well. And I'm sure Wales would have been the same as Northern Ireland in this sense. People didn't talk about sex very openly. Now, what happens after the Second World War is, with the renewed reporting of sex scandals in ever more lurid detail from the tabloid press, and then with, of course, Save Ulster from Sodomy. Well, we know what sodomy means. And then all of a sudden you've got an open discussion about sexual acts. And then people get upset because they're being forced to confront probably what they already knew was happening, but they're having to think about it now. And it's on the front page of the newspaper. So all of a sudden it becomes much more difficult, I think. And the degree of tolerance is somewhat lower. But just incidentally, there's a great historian from Wales who is probably the best gay historian of Britain there has ever been, called Geoffrey Weeks, and he's from the Valleys. And he wrote a memoir recently of growing up in the Valleys. So you should look that up.
Any other questions or comments?
Can I just ask, your book starts in the 1880s, did you say? Does your research go back even further than that?
Not really, no. So the logic for starting in the 1880s is a couple of reasons. Firstly, that is when the law changes and then the criminal records become more apparent. It's also the case that Belfast, which is my focus, has grown massively in the mid-19th century. So it's a very different place to what it was before. So it kind of makes sense. And I start the book with something I didn't talk about today, which is the discovery of a gay brothel in 1890. But that'll have to wait for another talk.
Yes.
Yes, as Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe featured a lot in your work.
As a kind of a contextual influence, certainly, in the kind of his campaign that begins in the 50s is definitely influencing what is happening here, in that the police are starting to crack down a bit more. And it's quite interesting, the case I mentioned in 1952 of, you know, the kind of upper class elites corrupting working class soldiers, that is then all played out again in 1954 with the much more famous case of Montagu, someone remember his name? Lord Montagu, of Booley or wherever it is. So those kind of models are crossing over. There is communication. Now, I don't know whether Maxwell Hyde would have been telling the Belfast police, you know, you need to arrest more men. But I think certainly they would have been aware of what was happening. And the most scandalous case here in 1958, when about 18 men are arrested in Lurgan in one fell swoop, that's informed by that culture, the nasty culture that's happening in England as well, I think.
And I think a number of them were actually Second World War veterans.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, from the newspaper reports at the time.
Right.
Just what I remember, Tom, are there ways in which we would be able to contribute to your project if we were interested, or if it was relevant, or?
Yeah, we're interested in two things, which firstly, anyone who has memories that go back, I guess, into the 60s and the 70s, you know, we're eager to hear from those. And my colleague Charlie, who's here, he's been doing oral histories with older men, and we're doing oral histories with older women as well. We're also interested in talking to people who had gay relatives or friends who may no longer be here. And you can, you know, tell us about them, you know, so even though they can't tell their story, we might be able to capture some of that too. And that goes for archives and materials, you know, if you were a diary writer in the 1970s, we'd love to hear from you. You know, any kind of material like that survives is welcome.
Okay.
There's a guy whose name I can't remember, he sort of rose the ranks in GB, in the Arts Council and stuff. He's called Brian Robinson. Oh, yes, yes. Brian Robinson. Yeah. Brian, yes, he kept the diary. He had to keep the diary. No,
This one, I've maybe seen a page of this shared in email with Jeff. So it's...
Yes, and sorry to interrupt, Brian, but he was in the gay youth group and arrived at about the age of 15, and we were very, very worried about, you know, 15-year-olds putting them in contact with other young people because of the law, which was totally illegal, but especially for young people. And so I organized. I was teaching at Queen's, and I had a Queen's. Queen's had residences for newly arrived staff, so I hosted a sort of gay young people's party where all of the people were, you know, 15 or 16, all boys, and about 6 of them. And at that age, kept a diary about 2 years ago. The diary, which describes the party, and I had forgotten, most of it, but when it jogged my memory about events. But if he's got a diary, of course, he left Northern Ireland.
Yes.
So the rest of it, as a student, he went over to England.
Right.
So.
But he is contacted us.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I mean,
I have seen-
that will be tremendous source.
Yeah, I would love to see that.
Yeah.
That would be.
Yeah. There's another diary I've been using, which is from even earlier, which is from 1918, of C.S. Lewis's best friend, a guy called Arthur Greaves from East Belfast. And that diary has ended up in a religious college in Illinois. So I had to fly over to look at that, but that diary shows that men in Belfast in 1918 were already reading the latest gay novels and sexological literature and so on. So diaries are the best source, really, because you don't get that criminal view. You get the kind of the real view of what people actually thought and how they felt.
In your research, sorry to ask another question, have you ever come across any of the descendants, or not, maybe not descendants, but the families of these people and how they feel about them now, looking back?
That's a great question, and
Yeah.
and I'm not just flattering your ego. I mean, it's a difficult one because the ethics of this is that we are not naming anyone who is still alive, obviously, because that would be unethical.
Say obviously.
Well, because it's unethical to people who've been in criminal cases deserve anonymity. It's an ethical conundrum for historians. But we have found evidence of descendants, and I'm always unsure of whether to approach them or not. And I have done a couple of times through ancestry.com. People doing their family tree.
They've got as black sheep of the family.
Not necessarily, although usually they're like, well, it's my great uncle twice removed.
Yeah.
I know nothing about him,
Yeah.
But the diarist who I mentioned, who were doing the radio show on, he had lots of great nieces and great nephews who he was clearly close to in the 60s, who must still be alive. So we're going to try and get in contact with them, I think.
Yeah.
You've probably been listening to the James and John novel. Have you? The Book of the Week.
Oh, no, I haven't, no.
Oh, you don't know about it? It's worth listening to. Radio for 9:45 it's a new book published by a Welsh MP.
Oh, Chris Bryant.
Yeah. But it describes the lives of the 2 last men who were hanged in Britain in 1835,
Right.
I think. And I'm amazed at the amount of detail he's been able to find about the actual movements of these people, their families, and the court, and so forth. But it's you can listen to it in playback on radio.
And the author's on the run then, is he right?
There's always a Bally's connection.
I think we're going to have to bring it to a close there, but I want to thank Tom again for coming tonight and giving a terrific talk. Let's show our appreciation again. Thank you so much. Well, thanks so much to all of you for coming along tonight. Just to mention, we are doing monthly lectures and talks. So our next talk is on Thursday, the 21st of March. We've been talking about men tonight. This is all about women. Historian and curator Rachel Sayers will be speaking on the recruitment, training and role of the Women's Royal Naval Service in Northern Ireland during the Second World War. And you can book for that through our website. There is still plenty of tea and coffee and biscuits. Don't feel you have to rush off. You're very welcome to look around the museum. We're open every weekday from 10 o'clock to 4:30, and we're open every Saturday from 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Completely free to visit, and you can follow us on our social media as well. But thank you again for tonight.
This talk's always in here.
Yes, I have. Yeah.